Well, hello there, friends. I'm Marley Bird, and this is week 3 of the My First Knit Summer Vest Knit Along. This is a 4-week knit along series where I walk you through step by step everything you need to know to create this beautiful vest pattern. By this point in the knit along, you have completed the body of the vest completely, and you've divided for the back and the 2 fronts. In this video, I will continue on with the back only. We will do the fronts in video 4. So for this part of the knit along, we will only be working on those back stitches, which means even though there's a lot to cover in today's video and in this week's homework, it will go really quickly because we have a very small number of stitches to work with. As you know, this is a free pattern from Yarnspirations.com, and as always, I have put a link in the video description box right down there below to take you to where you can get that free pattern and all the extra information you need. Now, as I mentioned, there's a lot to cover in today's video. I have it all written down for me so I don't miss a thing. And if you are ready, I am ready. Grab your homework, grab your pattern, grab your yarn, grab your extra set of yarn, and we'll get going. First up on the agenda is to talk about the yarn and how to add the yarn to your project when you run out of yarn. Whether you're on the bottom of your project or on the back, it's important that we know how we want our color sequence to go. Now, for my example here and the sample, I did pull the yarn from the center of both the cupcake and the nautical yarn. So down here, this was the start of my project from pulling from the center. As I go through my entire project and I work through both of these balls of yarn, I obviously am going to end up out here with this lighter shade of white and out here with like more of the white and the blue together. As this runs out, if I'm still on the bottom, let's say, I then have to decide, do I want to reverse my color order where I begin now where I ended, or do I want to go back to the center and pull out? I'll be completely honest. It doesn't matter to me if you start your color sequence at the same point that you did your cast on, or if you do it in reverse. Whatever makes you happy with your project. I know with the larger sizes that you will be going through more color sequences than the smaller sizes. That's just the name of the game because we have more stitches and our project is wider, so our color changes are thinner. You just need to be happy with whatever you choose. One thing that is very important though is when we choose to add our yarn for the back of our project and the fronts of our project, it is right now that we have to make sure all of our yarn sets are ready to go at the same point in the color changes. Let me show you 2 different ways that you can accomplish this. The first way is to grab a generic kitchen scale just like this and weigh your yarn that you have remaining that you plan on using for the back of your project. So this is the part we would be working on for the homework right now. So I want to make sure I weigh each one individually. So I can weigh this one first and it's 6.5 grams. So then I would take my pattern and I would just make a note, not 6.5, it's 65 grams. I'm sorry, 65 grams. And then I would weigh my second color, which is my nautical, and it's 67 grams. So then I would make a note, 67 grams, okay? I now know how much yarn is remaining in each ball of yarn in my set that I am using for my back. What I can do now is when it's time for me to do the fronts, I can take one set and I can put my yarn on the scale and then I can either begin to wind off from the center until I get to the 67 grams on here, and I will be out here to about this point in the project. So that way I know I am starting roughly at the same point in my yarn ball as I did in this one. Does that make sense? And I can wind it off just in a basic ball through my hand, or I can wind it off on a ball winder, okay? Once I do it with that one, I would do the same thing with this one, and Bob's your uncle, okay? If you don't have a scale, that comes a little bit trickier, but it is absolutely possible. Instead of weighing your yarn, what you would do is you would grab all of the yarn you have remaining and you would designate it for where you're going to use it on your project. So for example, I would say this would be for my right front, this would be for my back, and then I'd have 2 more balls of yarn over here for my left front. Then what I can do is sort of eyeball where it is in this project that the yarn is remaining in this ball of yarn. So I can take a look here and I can see I'm sort of to the blackish, darkish blue color and the blue, and I can come over here and I can say, okay, I know I've worked through all of the teal, so I know I'm not going to have any of the teal remaining. So I know it's about there that I'm going to have to remove and start at about that point. So I can either pop this out completely or I can wind it off to about that point. And then I want to do the same thing to the yarn that would go to my left front so that they're all roughly at the same point, okay? Don't get rid of the yarn you've just pulled out though, whether you've pulled out from the center or pulled out from the outside, because you will be able to use that later on if you should run out of what you have left here and you need to go back to this part. You'll have to make that decision as it comes. Does that make sense? You'd also want to do the same with your cupcake. You would try and get to the point where you roughly are in the same color placement so that way you can carry on for the front. What this does is it allows your 2 fronts especially to be at the same point in the color change, so as you're working your fronts, they can be as identical as possible. If the back is a little bit off, nobody's really going to tell, but if your fronts are a little bit off, it's definitely going to be a little bit more noticeable. So if there's a place to fudge it a little bit, that would be in the back color changes. The last thing I do want to mention is that if all of this is too much for you and you just want the colors to fall where they may, you absolutely can. Nobody is telling you you can't do that. There are no knitting police. You go ahead and you do what works best for you. Hopefully that answers your questions regarding the yarn. Now you know how to prep your yarn for the fronts and the back, and you're ready to join the yarn for the back and get ready for those back armhole shaping. But before we can jump into that, we need to take a look at some charts and the pattern. That brings us to number 2 on our agenda, the pattern. One thing I want to point out on the pattern for week 3 is that the pattern stitch repeat is written slightly different for rows 9 and 18. Remember at the end of video 2, I mentioned that we need to establish our pattern for the fronts and the back as we were working our row 9 and binding off for our armholes. As we worked through row 9, we made sure to count across those stitches of the armhole to see where our stitch pattern began for the back so we could continue in that pattern. We did the same thing for the front as well. So you are going to maintain that established pattern that you created at the end of week 2 to carry on through the back. As you work the shaping for the armholes in this week, it might interfere with some of the wrap stitches, so once again, you will want to make sure that you make those wrap stitches stockinette stitch if you cannot complete a full 5-stitch wrap after doing the shaping for the armhole. Now the armhole shaping is really easy and it is written in the instructions very easy. Looking at the pattern, we can see we are working on the back in this week's instructions, and it says with the wrong side facing, we will join color A and color B together as a set to the back of the vest. These are the only stitches that are left on your needle at this point. The right front and the left front should be on a piece of scrap yarn or a stitch holder. It then says to continue in the stitch pattern, decreasing 1 stitch at each end of every right side row, and then it gives you the number of times you're going to do that depending on the size you're making. This number sequence right here, those are the number stitches you will have remaining on your back after you've done these decreases. Now these decreases for the armhole, they are going to be worked on either side of the back because this is the back of your vest. And we want to make sure that we work those decreases in full fashion. Yeah, I just gave you a new vocabulary word. Full fashion decreases means that you will work your decreases so they lean in the same direction as the fabric. Let's draw this out. So we have our back right here, okay? And we have all of these stitches we're going to begin to shape. As we shape these stitches and we create our armhole that comes in here and our armhole that comes in here, the stitches that we work at this point and this point, we want to lean this direction on this side and this direction on this side. So over here, for these to lean to the left, we will work an SSK. And for these to lean to the right, we work a knit two together. Okay? So even though the pattern itself says decrease one stitch and it doesn't tell you what type of decrease to do, we now know that we're going to do full fashion decreases because it makes the finishing of our project look better. There's one more little hint here that I'm going to throw in there. As you're working decreases on any sort of project, it's best to work a decrease one stitch in from the edge. So you never work the decrease on that very edge stitch on either side. You will always work it one stitch in from the edge. That means if you were starting the row, it would be knit one and then SSK. To the last 3 stitches, then it would be knit 2 together, knit 1. Keeping that one stitch from the edge and stockinette stitch as you're doing any sort of shaping is something you can add to your knitter's toolbox. It's one of those generic things that happens with most patterns. It's very rare you will find a pattern where a decrease or an increase is worked at the very edge of an item. So now you have a vocabulary word and something in your knitter's toolbox. Really quickly, I do want to reference the chart that we talked about in video 2 for those of you who are visual learners, so you can see how these decreases can be charted out for you so you can learn visually. Right down here is the same planning chart for the size small vest I showed you in video 2. And this is a reminder, you can make a chart like this on your own using graph paper or maybe an Excel spreadsheet or a Google sheet, totally up to you. This is purely for those of you who want to plan out your project in chart format because you're more visual like me. The only thing you have not seen in this little example is right down here with chart number 5, and that's because it has the armhole shaping that we will be working in this week's homework. Can you see how this down here sort of has a zigzag every 2 rows on either side? That represents my decreases. So as my decreases are made for the pattern, I can incorporate those in, and that makes my actual armhole space where there aren't any stitches here get a little bit bigger. What this does is it allows me to see if my decreases interfere with any of my stitch pattern repeats in here, and I can begin to plan out if I need to make any adjustments. A lot of you won't need to do a chart like this, but if you do like a chart like this, I did want to show you how that does work up in your project, okay? Regardless if you make a chart or not, it's important that you work your stitch pattern as established and you decrease 1 stitch at each end of every right side row for the number of times for the size you're making. That brings us to item number 3 on the agenda, how to work those decreases. This swatch represents the back of a sweater, so I am ready to work my first decrease row on the back, and I'm going to decrease 1 at this edge and 1 at this edge. Now remember, at this edge, I want my stitches to lean to the left and I want them to curve up, so I'll be doing an SSK over here. And I will do it 1 stitch in from the edge. All right, so let's start off with that over here. So I will knit 1 stitch and then work an SSK. So I slip 1 as if to knit, slip 1 as if to knit, take my left hand needle, put it in the front leg of those 2 stitches, and then knit them together. Now I've worked my decrease. I need to now continue on in pattern. Well, this would be a row 11, so I just simply knit across my row. So there's nothing else I have to worry about. It's when I get to a row 18 or a row 9 that I really have to pay attention to where my wraps are going to land. For this one, I simply have to knit down to the last 3 stitches, and I will work a knit 2 together at the other end of the back. Here we are, I'm to the last 3 stitches. So this one I knit 2 together, so I go into the 2nd stitch from the tip of my needle and the first one, and I knit them together. And then I knit 1 and stop. So that's the end of my first decrease row. Once that decrease is complete, you simply turn your work and purl back. It's that simple, you guys. Those decrease rows are as easy as working an SSK at the start and a knit two together at the end. And you repeat that on the right side rows as many times as listed in the pattern. From that point on, you just continue on in your established pattern, making sure your wraps line up until your armhole measures the distance listed in the pattern. Here is a tip. Make sure that you keep track of how many rows you have completed on the back of your work. So that way, after you do your shaping on the front of your work, you can work the exact number of rows as the back and your armholes will match up. Bada bing, bada boom. I'm telling you, it makes it so much easier. Once your back is complete, it's time to shape the shoulders, which brings us to number 4 on our agenda, short rows. Using short rows to do shoulder shaping allows us to get a nice slope at the shoulders. So that way, as we wear the vest, it will lay nicely on our body because our body is not made perfectly square. We all have a nice slope at our neck and our shoulders, and that will make the vest lay better. The short row method chosen for this pattern is the wrap and turn, which is a very basic short row method that is a good one for you to have in your knitter's toolbox. I also want to point out that these number rows out here do not coincide with these number rows, meaning no matter what row you end on up here, you should have ended on a wrong side row, so that the first row you do for your shoulder shaping is a right side row. And you will work in your established pattern to the last however number of stitches for the size you're making, and then work your wrap and turn. And then your second row will be a wrong side. So in theory, like this first row here, it could be a row 5, say, and then your second row could be a row 6. I mean, who knows? My point here is that don't think, oh my gosh, I've got to adjust what row I'm on because these numbers say so. That's not the case. You're still going to maintain the stitch pattern that you have established. These simply mean that we're going to work a total of 7 rows to work this total shoulder shaping. All right. So I want to show you how to do these wrap and turns. So when you get to that part, you can easily complete it. Let's go ahead and pull in our swatch here. We're going to use this once again. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pretend that this is my row 1 of my short rows. And I will work down, and I'm going to follow the extra small size. I'm going to work down to the last 7 stitches, okay? All right, so I worked in my established pattern to where I have 7 stitches left. I then work a wrap and turn. So I bring my yarn forward, I slip my next stitch, bring my yarn back to the back, and turn my work. I will then slip this stitch over and continue on. So now I will purl until I get down to the last number of stitches written for number 2, okay? Because I'm on my established pattern. I'm not on a wrap row. I don't have to worry about that. I'm just still working in stockinette. Having said that, I highly recommend that if your shoulder shaping lands on a wrap row, I would just make that entire row stockinette stitch. I wouldn't even make it wraps. I would just keep it in stockinette, keep it real simple for yourself so that you don't have to stress about adding wraps in with the short rows. All right. So for this, I'm going to get all the way down to the last 7 stitches again for this one. See, 2, 4, 6, 7. And as I do my wrap and turn, okay, so I'm down here. I have 7 stitches left. I'm going to do my wrap and turn. So I bring my yarn back, slip the next stitch, bring my yarn back forward, turn my work. Oh, and I just messed that up, so I'm going to go back. Okay. Everything's falling off my needles. All right, so here we are. We're at the 7 stitches. Bring my yarn to the back, slip my stitch, bring my yarn back forward, turn my work, slip that stitch back over to my needle, and then I continue on. So now this would be my row 3, and I'm working in my established pattern. Again, I would recommend keeping all of this just in stockinette, no matter what. and I would work my established pattern to the number of stitches written for row 3. And this is the number of stitches from your last wrap and turn, okay? So let's pretend that I am just following along with the extra small here. This would be 5 stitches. So I want to stop at 5 stitches from my previous wrap and turn. So as I'm working here, I want to make sure I find my wrap and turn, and you'll see it. It looks like the stitch is kind of getting choked by that wrap. And you want to make sure that you stop 5 stitches with that wrap. So let's see, there's my wrap and turn. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then the instructions specifically say work in pattern to 5 stitches before the last wrap and turn. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I would do this one. I do wrap and turn again. Bring my yarn forward, slip my stitch, bring my yarn to the back. Now I'm going to change this up. I can turn my work like I did before, or I can slip my stitch over and then turn my work. Both are the same, okay? You'll notice that row 4 is just like row 3, except I am just purling because it's the opposite side of my stockinette. And finding that wrapped stitch on the wrong side is a little bit tricky, so you do want to make sure that you count accordingly from that wrapped stitch. I'm going to have to find mine real quick. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That was my wrap stitch. You can see it's kind of hard to see. There's a gap there, so that helps. So then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's going to be my wrapped stitch, that 5th one there. So I've got 2 more to go. All right, so that is 5 after my last wrap and turn. So I'm going to wrap and turn this one. So my yarns move to the back, slip my stitch, bring my yarn forward, and I can move my yarn or my slipped stitch back and then turn. All right, so that would have been row 4. So 5 and 6 for all the sizes, we're going to work all the way back now, and we're going to pick up our wrap and turns, okay? So we only have 2 wrap and turns on either side. You with me? So at this point, I leave all of these stitches unworked. So I'm just going to work in my pattern, which is just knitting, until I get to that stitch that has the wrap and turn. I am coming up to my first wrap and turn. I want to pick up my wrap from this side. I want to pick up my leg from this side and place it on my needle. And see how it's right next to my stitch there? It's a matter of debate whether you want that wrap in the front or in the back. You do what you think is best, but the important thing here is that you knit that wrap and that stitch together, okay? Once you've done that, you carry on to the next wrap and turn. So you come down to the next one, and you will pick up this wrap from the front, place it on your needle without twisting it. Again, you could place it in front of the stitch or behind it. Let's place it behind it on this one so you can see what the difference is. And then you knit it together with the stitch that it was wrapped. And then you carry on down the row. So you would go all the way to the end of the row. And we'll take a look at those wraps, okay? So once you've done that, you can see your wraps, if you count on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there's one wrap, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's the second wrap right there. Okay, they're just kind of incorporated into the project. So that would be row 5. So you would turn your work, and on row 6, we're going to purl back, and when we come to our wraps, we're going to pick them up and purl them together with the stitch they're wrapping. But we want to make sure that they look nice on the right side of the fabric. So when we pick up our wraps, we will pick them up from what would be the back leg as we're looking at it, but it's the leg that's closest to the right side of the fabric. So let me get down there to those purl wraps. I am coming up to my first wrap stitch here on the purl side. So let's see here, it's right here. Can you see? So there's the wrap right there. Okay, so what I want to do is I kind of want to put my work this way. I want to look at the front of my fabric, and I want to pick up my wrap from the front, make sure it's not twisted, and place it on my needle, okay? And then I will purl that wrap together with that stitch it was wrapping, okay? So that's what it looks like on the right side. And then I purl over to the next wrap. I will be sure to turn my work here so you can see what the front looks like a little bit better. So this is my next wrap. So there's my wrap. I'm not going to pick it up on this side and put it up, remember, because I want the front to look good. So I take a look at the front here and make sure I grab the wrap from the front. And make sure you get the wrap. And place it on the needle. Make sure yarn is in front, and then purl it together with the stitch that was wrapped. And then you just carry on to get to the end. Let me get down here. And then turn your work. So now all of the stitches are in play again, and our wrap stitches from our purl side look really nice. Like there's nothing visible here. It's one right there and there's one right there. But now we have some very subtle shaping happening where we have a nice slope coming up for the shoulders. That brings us to number 5 on our agenda, putting stitches on holders and binding off for the neck. The good news is what we're getting ready to do is very similar to what we did for the end of week 2. We are going to work across in pattern the number of stitches indicated for the size we are making. Once we reach that number of stitches, we will then take those stitches and place them on scrap yarn. So I'm just going to knit across some stitches here, and let's just pretend that that's the number of stitches we're supposed to have. So then I take my tapestry needle, my scrap yarn, and I place all of those stitches on the scrap yarn. Once you have those stitches secured on the scrap yarn, once again, I always tie the ends of my scrap yarn together so that way I don't accidentally pull one end and those stitches fall apart. And now we're supposed to bind off stitches. So we know how to do this as well. We start off with our knit 2. Have the back stitch jump over the front stitch, and that's 1 stitch bound off. So you will do that for the number of stitches you need to bind off for the back of the neck. Once you've reached the number of stitches bound off for the back of the neck, remember this last stitch here counts as part of your stitch count for your other shoulder. So you would carry on working in pattern, which should just be knitting, to the end of the row, and then you will place these stitches on a scrap yarn holder as well. So by the end of this week, you will have both your right and left shoulder on scrap yarn and your neck bound off. So grab some scrap yarn and do it again. Once your stitches are on your holder, make sure you tie it. Remove your tapestry needle first though. I have made the mistake of not doing that before. Okay, so now my needles are done. And if I were to set this down, if this were my full project, I'd have a shoulder, some neck stitches right there, and that would be my full back. What do you think? You can do this, right? It might seem like a lot of stuff thrown at you at once, but I promise once you get started, you'll get the hang of it, and this part of your vest will be done in no time. That's everything you need to know to complete this week's instructions. As you're working along on your vest, be sure to share with us on social media. Use hashtag MarleyBird or hashtag Yarnspirations so I can smash your like button. And don't forget to join the Marley Bird Knit Along group on Facebook. It is full of wonderful knitters who are there to encourage you, to answer questions, and to give you some inspiration along the way. We would love to have you there. All right, I can't wait to see you next week when we tackle the fronts and the collar and the seaming. I'm Marley Bird. I'll talk to you soon. Bye, guys.